So this is just showing you what I was telling you earlier, the proportion of ANA data that was captured per province. And we can see, the mouse, yes, it does work, yes. So in the Eastern Cape, these are the number of records that we have. These are the number of schools that we think exist in those provinces based on EMIS. And then we can calculate schools in the data set divided by estimated target schools. And we can see in the Western Cape, you've got about 99% of the observations are there, whereas in the Eastern Cape, only 23% of the observations are actually there. And remember I told you earlier about the Gauteng province thing. You've got 750,000 observations in Gauteng, but as soon as we look for duplicates based on learner ID, province, EMIS number, grade number, date of birth, surname, name, literacy score, and numeracy score. In other words, if an individual had the same for every single one of those, we think it's a duplicate. Then you drop it, and now it drops to 66%, or only 493,000. Okay. So if you hadn't done a duplicates check like that, and you just analyzed the data, that's very suspect. Because you're basically just doubling up what you're doing on 30% of the data. Okay, so the reason why I chose KZN is because it has a relatively high proportion of data. It's still suspect because you haven't got the worst, probably the worst 30% of schools. But I didn't just want to use the Western Cape because KZN is one of the biggest, it is the biggest province, and it also has other issues that are not that similar to the Western Cape. It's got a much higher proportion of quintile 1, 2, and 3 schools. It also has a much higher proportion of students that are switching the lot from grade 3 to grade 4. So non-random returns means there's a serious sample selection issue here. We can't trust stuff that's coming from the Eastern Cape because you're looking at the best 23% of schools in the Eastern Cape and comparing it to the best 82% of schools in the Free State, the best 56% of schools in the Gauteng province, etc. So what I do is for the rest of the report only analyze Western Cape and KZN. But even KZN, ideally we would have 100%, but there actually wasn't another province that had 100% data captured. The reason why we couldn't use verification ANA, because that might be one of the suggestions, is why don't you just use verification ANA, which has legitimate averages for each province. The problem is because verification ANA was only created to be representative of the provinces, it's not representative of the district or of an individual school. Whereas because you have ANA data on every single school, technically if it was captured, you can actually identify a particular school, as we'll see. So school classification, these are the 8 categories, and those are school quintiles. So one of the interesting findings here is that you have a large number, or sort of 400 odd schools up here in quintile 4 and 5 that are either classified as dysfunctional or underperforming. Some people have this misconstrued notion that all quintile 5 schools are great. It's simply not true. I think when we look at the data we see that that's not true. Similarly, if you look down here at quintile 1 and 2, there's a not insignificant number of schools that are, although they're very poor, are still performing at the great or excellent level of performance. And these are the schools that we think are very interesting, and if this persisted over time, in other words, we knew that these schools really were good performers. This wasn't just a fluke occurrence, or it wasn't just teachers that were cheating. Then we would actually want to go and visit these schools and figure out why are they performing so well in spite of their poverty. And this is actually what one of the studies in the Western Cape is doing. Ursula Hoadley is looking at schools, I think it's about 30 schools in the Western Cape in a project. Hey? Is it 9? Why did I think it was 30? 9 schools in the Western Cape that are performing above demographic expectations, or the project is called Schools Performing Above Demographic Expectations, where they're going into these schools and sort of documenting the qualitative evidence for why those schools are performing well or just below average for their quintile. So this is showing you the graph of dysfunctional schools, the proportion or percentage of dysfunctional schools, which is the red, relative to excellent schools, which is the blue. And remember that for all provinces except the Western Cape, we think that the red number would actually go up significantly because a lot of the dysfunctional schools actually weren't captured because they never sent their data returns in. And notice that there are very, very few schools in these provinces. Limpopo actually did have a high degree of, let's just check, of data that was captured. Limpopo, no, 56%. There was one other. Northern Cape. Northern Cape is something we actually can look at. You can see in the Northern Cape, where almost all the data was captured, only 1% of schools were classified as excellent, but 24% of schools were classified as dysfunctional. In stark contrast to only 3% of schools in the Western Cape that were classified as dysfunctional, and 6% of schools that were classified as excellent. So, sometimes people get, when we show these abstract representations of performance, we say, oh, underperforming, dysfunctional. But what does that actually mean? What does it mean to be an underperforming student or performing below grade expectations? So I'm going to show you two questions. The one is from the grade 3 numeracy questionnaire. The other one is from the grade 6 questionnaire. So this one, it asks students, it's the 18th question, what is the length of the pencil? And I won't test your numeracy knowledge. It's 15 centimeters. But only 40% of grade 3 students can get this right in South Africa. And this is verification ANA, so this is sort of trustworthy results. The majority of students can't get this question right. And this was in home language. So this is before the Lold switch. But notice the difference in performance between quintiles 1, 2, and 3, where only 37% between 32 and 40% in quintile 1 to 4 could get it right, compared to about 60% in quintile 5 that can get this question right. But again, as someone pointed out, I've presented this before, they said this still means that 40% of quintile 5 students can't get this right. 42% of quintile 5 students can't get this right either. So again, these are systemic problems, not just isolated to poorer schools. The next question comes from the grade 6 numeracy test, and it asks, the following graph represents water usage of one household per week. Use the information in the graph to answer the following questions. How many liters of water does the household use to shower and garden? And we can see that these are the water usage categories, and this is the number of liters used in each one. So it's a simple graphical interpretation where you have to extract one piece of data from a graph well within the grade 6 curriculum. So they would have to identify that's where the shower bar is, it uses 60 liters. That's where the gardening bar is, it uses 30 liters. Add the two together, 90 liters. But less than a third of students can get that right in grade 6. Less than 1 in 4, or about 1 in 4 students can get that right in quintile 1 and 2, compared to half of students in quintile 5. But the reason why I find it helpful to put these things up is for us to get an idea of a child who's been doing numeracy for 6 years of formal full-time schooling can't do something like this, which is well within the curriculum. Means that there's real big problems that we have that we need to address. This is showing you for the Western Cape what is the average numeracy score relative to the literacy score in a particular school. So we've got numeracy score on the x-axis and literacy score on the y-axis. So for this school over here, this black dot, we can see that that is a quintile 1 school. It's got about maybe 55% as its numeracy score and about 45% for its literacy score. Read across over there. So what are some of the observations here that stand out to you? Anyone? Yeah.
Most of the schools are performing better in literacy than in numeracy.
Okay, good. So because the observations lie to the left of this diagonal line, it means that they're performing better in the y-axis, which is literacy, than they are in numeracy. What else? Good. Good. So we can find schools in quintile 5, which is this sort of pink dot, are all performing to the right, sort of to the upper end of the distribution. And again, they are also performing better in literacy than they are in numeracy. Yeah. So there are some schools, quintile 1 schools, that are performing well, And likewise, some quintile 5 schools that are performing badly. Okay, so this is one of the reasons why the data analysis that you are doing now is really helpful, because if you ask the question, what is that school? Which is this quintile 5 school over here that's performing so poorly? You could actually go and find it in the data. You could go and find that EMIS number and that school name. Similarly, you could find out, if we had time, we could even do it now, what is the name of that school in the Western Cape? Which district is it from? Instead of splitting this by quintile, I could have done a scatter plot by district. Which are the districts that are performing better? Are some districts performing better in literacy than numeracy? All of these types of questions are very easy to answer when you've got the data in front of you. Now this is the same picture, except now we are looking at KZN. This is actually literacy. I made a mistake in labeling this variable. But notice that it's a scatter plot. It's all over the show. It doesn't look like there's a systematic trend of quintile 5 schools being much better than the lower quintiles. And it also doesn't look like we have much higher literacy performance than numeracy performance. It seems to be more all over the show. Okay? There's less clear patterns here. I'm not sure if anyone else has any observations that they can see. The scale, we can see that a lot of them are clumped around 40, whereas here, also clumped around 40, but the higher quintile schools are all sort of above between 50 and 80, whereas here, between 50 and 80, there are not a lot of schools, and they're all over the sort of the spectrum. Okay. So another thing that might be interesting to look at is what are the correlations between the different grades. So we've got 6 grade scores. We've got grade 1 numeracy, grade 2 numeracy, grade 3 numeracy, etc. We would expect in very good schools, or schools with high internal accountability, that the correlation between grade 1 and grade 6 would be quite high. When we say correlation, we mean that if grade 1 performs well, grade 6 should also perform well. It would be unlikely in a very good school that you would have one brilliantly performing group of students and one very bad performing group of students. So all that correlation is telling you is that they're moving in the same direction. So the point to take away from this is that the correlations in the Western Cape here seem much higher than the correlations in KZN. So this one over here is showing you that the correlation between grade 3 and grade 6 numeracy in the same school is quite low across the 1,145 schools in KZN. Only 0.51 correlation. But that same correlation in the Western Cape is 0.82. Okay? But again, you might say this is quite abstract. What does that correlation figure of 0.82 mean? Or 0.51 mean? So I've done a scatter plot showing you, again, the same. This is grade 6 on the y-axis. This is grade 3 on the x-axis. And what are some of the things we can see here? Anyone? Comparing the two.
On the left one, there's a clear relationship, a positive relationship.
Okay, good. So it seems like there's this relationship where as the y goes up, the x also goes up. You've got this sort of trend going up here, whereas over here it seems to be more scattered. There seems to be more all over the show. And again, let's take one dot and interpret it. This dot over here, that particular school got 80% as its grade 6 average, but only 30% as its grade 3 average. Whereas this observation over here got 85%, let's say, for its numeracy grade 6, and maybe 70%, 75% for its numeracy grade 3. Does that make sense? So these types of things are useful because it gives us an indication of the internal accountability of the school. Does the grade 4 teacher look at the grade 3 teacher's tests and ask the grade 3 teacher about the students? What are they doing well? What parts of the curriculum did they cover? Does the grade 4 teacher speak to the grade 5 teacher? Is there cross-marking? Do grade 6 teachers sometimes mark grade 5 students? Those types of things which we find in better functioning schools.
Nick, also while you're there, the one on the right, some of those close to the to the x-axis, right at the bottom. Now, if one say look at that, so it's almost zero performance in the one, and 50% plus performance in the other.
Yeah.
it makes one wonder whether there has been some cheating in the one. Because you wouldn't expect a school where the one grade is
so perhaps the numeracy teacher, well actually they should be the same teacher. But yeah, we would also, so this is one thing which comes out from the international literature, is the last thing you want to do is point fingers and be wrong. So here we would actually go and check, are these not just perhaps data errors, maybe someone captured them wrong, maybe, I don't know, maybe it's a data error, maybe the Excel doesn't think it's a number, so it's calculated it as a 0, something like that. So before you do this, you would always double check, triple check what you're doing before you would classify a school. So I think that is very sketchy, but this is super worrying. One school gets 10% in grade 3 and 70% in grade 6. Seems highly suspect. And again, this is not just based on 5 students. It's based on at least 10 students in that grade. Okay, and Elmore says here, from the American case, but I think it's very pertinent to this, the fact that learning is supposed to occur in classrooms and schools is no guarantee that it actually does, nor does the existence of the school as an organization assure that the learning that occurs in one classroom bears any necessary relationship to what occurs in another classroom. So this is pointing to things like internal accountability, where in a very dysfunctional school, you may have a good teacher who just that teacher performs well, but the rest of the school doesn't perform well. Whereas we think in better performing schools, there's this sort of culture of accountability between teachers, between grades, etc. Okay, so now this is showing you breakdown by language. So we have a variable in the ANA data set called LOA, which we believe is a language of assessment. And don't worry about these bottom graphs for now, this bottom 4. Let's just look at this top one up here. So we can see that this is the language distribution by grade in KZN. The black bars are Siswati, the blue bars are isiZulu, and the red bars are English. So we can see in grade 1 that 25% of students are learning in English. This is in the whole province. Whereas 66% of students are learning in isiZulu and 3% of students are learning in Siswati, and then the rest are just a bunch of other languages, but too small to put on the graph. Similarly, in grade 2, you've got some students that are learning in English, but most are learning in Zulu. And the same in grade 3, but then what happens? The old switch from grade 3 to grade 4, and now you have 90% of students in grade 4 that are learning in English, and only a small proportion that are learning in other languages, isiZulu, Siswati, whatever. Now what we do is we take this exact same logic of looking at the language breakdown by grade, and we say what's happening in quintile 1, in quintile 2, in quintile 3, quintile 4, and quintile 5. So we can see that in quintile 1, 2, 3, and 4, there's roughly the same situation that's going on. You've got these students that are learning in Zulu, and then they switch to English in the grade 4, and then they learn in English for the rest of the time. There's a decreasing proportion. So there's an increasing proportion here of kids that are learning in English from grade 1, straight for English. Okay? But notice what's happening in quintile 5. So in quintile 5, you've got the majority of students, 80% of students, that are learning in English from day 1, from grade 1. They're learning in English. And then they learn in English their whole time, the majority. So we might say, oh, you know, this is rich white students, or this is students who naturally have English first language, so they're actually not learning in a second language. But if we look at the racial breakdown of the different quintiles, you can see that 65% of quintile 5 students are actually black in KZN. So we believe that most of these students, of the 65% of students that are black, would be second language English learners. And yet they are learning in English from day 1, or from grade 1, in quintile 5 schools. So in a sense, a lot of those quintile 5 schools are taking the straight for English approach. And these parents aren't sending their children there deliberately, obviously. So this is something that's quite interesting. And it's also something we need to look into more, given that LOLT is a big thing in South Africa, and that we think that that LOLT switch is very important and could also be one of the reasons why there's low performance late in the system. One of many other reasons as well. Okay, so some interesting questions that Anna can help to answer. Which are the quintile 1 to 3 schools that are performing well in spite of poverty? We've already identified some of those. how well does ANA data correlate with administrative data on student numbers? So we mentioned earlier the fact that principals have an incentive to inflate the numbers of students in their schools because their funding is allocated based on student numbers. So if we calculated, based on the annual survey of schools, how many students should be in the school, and then we look at how many students actually wrote ANA, that would give us an indication of, because you can't sort of, unless they write ANA results for these fictitious students, which is unlikely, the ANA results would be a very good indication of all of the students, except for some degree of absenteeism. We could also ask which schools, districts, or provinces are improving or deteriorating over time. So we can do that with the secondary schools because we have the matric data. But how do we do that at primary school without ANA? How do you know which schools are getting better or which schools are getting worse without ANA? Your guess is as good as the next person's. It also helps people to answer questions like, which is the best performing district in my province? Which is the best performing school in my district? Which is the best performing teacher in my school? And which is the best performing student in my class? And these questions are interesting for different people. A teacher might want to know which is the best performing student in my class. A principal might want to know which is the best performing teacher in my school. And parents might want to know which is the best performing school in my district. And provincial officials might want to know which is the best performing district in my province. Okay, and ANA a verified ANA where we can trust the results could answer all of these questions. And when we say verified, not a sample of schools that are verified. It would need to be externally marked and preferably administered at one grade by an external body, like the Systemics in the Western Cape. And that is actually what the Systemics, perhaps you guys can both comment on that, what they do use the Systemics for is identifying which schools are improving over time, and because it's externally marked, there's less of a worry about the fact that teachers are corrupting the results. The next important reason why we need this kind of data is for information dissemination. So information is a fundamental prerequisite for accountability. If we don't have information on how schools are doing, we cannot hold schools, principals, district officials accountable. Without a reliable measure, we cannot track progress or deterioration. And this, for me, was one of the clinching questions, is in the absence of standardized testing, how does a district official know which primary school needs what support? And this is a genuine question. Seriously, how do they do this? If there are any district officials here. Before ANA, and even perhaps post-ANA, given that the results weren't given to the districts necessarily, how do you identify an underperforming primary school? So secondary school, okay, we can look at the matric results, but what do you do at a primary school? You visit it. Does anyone know?
The end of the school year, then they have the promotion schedules that the curriculum facilitators to monitor, as well as, and I think the curriculum, the circuit managers must sign it off. So from there, information is submitted. They call it CMIS, Curriculum Management Information System. And then on CMIS, they capture it and they do an analysis. They're supposed to do that quarterly.
And what's in CMIS?
Sorry?
What is in CMIS? What data is there?
The performance per subject or per learning area, per term.
But how do they measure the performance if they don't have tests?
No, we're on the school-based assessment, the internal assessment.
Okay, so that's really, really sketchy because sometimes the school-based assessment is really not aligned with where it should be from a grade level. And that's one of the things you find in some of the less functional provinces, that school-based assessment is so weak, which is one of the reasons why we have ANA. So if they're using that as a measure of progress and saying that all the kids got 60% on the grade 4 test, that's really sketchy. Because that's an internally set test. We have no idea if that is the appropriate grade 4 level. Maybe it's the grade 2 level, which is again one of the reasons why we need standardized testing across the system. So now what I want to do is provide some examples of school and student reports to give you an idea of what's possible. So in this report that we wrote for UNICEF, I give examples of the different types of reports and what they could constitute. So it ranges from a comprehensive national report, which the DBE actually did do. They published this report. Comprehensive, they didn't do any of these ones. Comprehensive provincial report, concise district reports, detailed school reports, and concise learner reports. Okay? And these could also follow a particular format. The reason why, and I'll argue later as well, the reason why I think this should be done by the DBE, and I'm meaning national DBE, is because the schools that have the least competence to check what's wrong and what's right in the ANA results, in other words, to pick up, okay, my students are having a problem in a particular area of comprehension in English. That sort of meta ability to look at lots of tests and see where kids are going right and wrong is beyond the skills of a lot of schools, particularly in poor provinces and underperforming districts. Similarly, in provinces that are battling to administrate what's going on, to think that they will be able to provide detailed reports for every single school and potentially even every single learner is to overshoot the mark, I think. So from a data analysis perspective, it's not that costly once you've done it for one province to replicate it for all the provinces, because you're not actually writing up detailed paragraph writing, you're providing indicators like a dashboard for each province or for each school. So, remember I said to you earlier, and maybe some of these names might pop up in the two Western Cape officials' minds. These were all of the schools, I think there are about 30 here, these were all of the schools that popped up as being dysfunctional in ANA in the Western Cape. There were only 30 and these are them. And these were their scores. So I didn't list the KZN one because I think there was about 270 and so you can't see what's going on. But the point is that, for example, if you were the Cape Winelands district official, this is very helpful for you. Because now you know of the 70 schools that are in your district, Bonnie Esperance, Kaimandi, Petra Gedeng, FJ Conradi, Bergrivier, Ashton Public, and Ashton Public. Those are the schools that are performing the worst on the annual national assessments. So if you were in the Western Cape, you wouldn't actually use this. You would use the systemics because they're externally marked. But the point is that other provinces could do the same thing. Similarly for Eden and Central Karoo, for Metro Central, Metro East, Metro North. So we can see that there are hardly any schools. There's only one school in Metro Central that's classified as dysfunctional, and one school in Overberg that's classified as dysfunctional here. So this is again trying to show that you can identify a specific school and say that's the score for the school, whereas you can't do that with SACMEC or with NSCS or PEARLS or whatever. So this is the existing ANA report that the DBE has asked schools to send out with students. You can see the name of the school, the name of the learner, the percentage obtained by the learner, the level, they classify it, and then the grade average percent of the school. It's important to realize though that this is of the school. So if you saw 16% here and 12% there, you probably think your child is not doing so badly because it's doing better than the rest of the school. And this is the part where we are trying to sort of ask questions and potentially shift the discussion in this direction of providing comparative information on how did your child perform relative to the district average, relative to the quintile average that your school is in, relative to the quintile and district average that your child is in, for example. So this is a possibility for South African report cards. So I pretended I was the minister and wrote up a little report here to the parents and to principals and school governing bodies. And you can see here that it's showing this child, this particular child, his name is Peter Jacobs. I'm trying to think of the fake name. I know the real name as well. Peter Jacobs is this child, and he's in Ashbury Primary. Ashbury Primary is the real name. It's in Montague in the Western Cape. And you can see that Ashbury Primary, the score was 55% in grade 1, 49% in grade 2, and so on. This was the average for the whole school. And then I've got here Western Cape average, Cape Winelands average, which is the average district that this school is in. And then quintile 3 schools average in the Western Cape because this is a quintile 3 school. Okay? And then they can compare their results relative to similar quintiles, similar within the same district. And then these two graphs over here are just showing the performance of Ashbury Primary, which is the red line, relative to other schools in the same district, Cape Winelands, and in the same quintile, quintile 3. So it's in that same district and of the same socioeconomic status, roughly. And we can see that, maybe you can't see it there, and I don't know if I can see it here, but yeah, I can't see it. But the point is that these are school names, and these are schools that are performing better than this school, and you can see that it performs slightly worse in numeracy than it does in literacy. So even if we don't give this information to parents, for whatever reason, political, and you don't want certain schools to be burnt down and stuff, you can give this information to school governing bodies and principals, because they would find this information very useful and interesting. To know that your school, where does it perform relative to schools that are very similar to it in terms of socioeconomic status and children. And if you are this school over here, you might start thinking, flip, why are we performing so badly? And actually sit down with your teachers and say, it's not on that you're absent for 6 months of the year. And likewise, this one up here might say we're doing very well relative to the rest of our quintile in our district. We're performing really well. Well done. And to show teachers that are working very hard in, I don't know what, I can't read that, this school over here, that they're performing much higher than the average. But this school, we would also want to present, I haven't shown it here, but the averages relative to the whole of the Western Cape, relative to the whole country. Where does your school fit? And we can actually show you the graph with every single school on it. It bogs down PowerPoint. So the next thing that we wonder and we ask about is how do we get this information to parents in an understandable way? So not all parents are literate, not all parents can understand all of those numbers up there and be able to compare averages and all that kind of stuff. So this is just my very rudimentary basic attempt using paint of what it could be. But basically Ashbury Primary, this is the performance scale, and each one is just increasing by 5%. So if you were in the worst 5%, your little school would be over here. If you were in the best 5%, your school would be up there. So we can see that this school is performing slightly below average relative to similar schools, but in reading it's not performing as badly, it's performing slightly higher. Similarly for this guy called Peter Jacobs, he's performing quite badly in maths, and this is relative to students in his school, but in reading he's performing a little bit better as well. He's actually a little Brazilian kid. I took him from a Brazilian scorecard. Just cut him out and stuck him in here. So we also think that perhaps something like a school poster could work, where this thing could be printed quite big, stuck in the community in a prominent place, and even discussed. So they do this in Namibia. When results are released, the whole community gets together and they actually talk about how their school performed relative to the other schools. And this is actually sort of facilitated by the Department of Education. And that's also meant to encourage parents to participate, because there's someone encouraging them and asking them and telling them, whereas if you expect the principal to sit down and say, oh yeah, we're the worst school in the district, it's not going to happen. So you can see here that 64 out of the 105 learners in grade 1 got more than 50%, whereas none of the 118 learners in grade 6 scored more than 50% for maths, where 50% is that sort of lowest benchmark. And then again, we just hypothesizing here, but perhaps the parents would go home and say to their child who's in grade 6, were you one of the 15 that got more than 50%? Or were you over here? And sort of that type of dialogue of which we would expect in middle class families, where parents ask, how come you failed on your report? What's going on? You grounded, whatever, take away the PlayStation. You would find the equivalent of that in quintile 1 schools. You know, you've got twice as much work to do or something.